The richest families almost never keep their money where you think. I have spent years reading old trust filings, foundation charters, and probate records, and the pattern repeats so often it stopped surprising me. The money sits in a structure, not a bank. It lives behind a foundation, a holding company, a second class of stock that the public never sees. The family touches the controls, but their name is barely on the asset. The Fords are the cleanest example I have ever found. When Henry Ford died, the company he built did not pass to his heirs the way a house passes to a child. Most of it went into an institution the family had quietly created a decade earlier, and the family kept the steering wheel anyway. I am not a lawyer, and nothing here is advice for your situation. This is history. But it is the kind of history that explains why some fortunes survive 100 years and most disappear in three. So here is the question I want to sit with for the next few minutes. How does a family hand over 90% of a company and lose almost none of its power? The answer is older than you think, and the paperwork is public. Roll, slow pan across stacks of yellowed legal documents on a wooden desk. Lamplight. To understand what happened in 1947, you have to go back to 1936. That year, Edsel Ford and his father, Henry Ford, signed the papers that created the Ford Foundation. On paper, it was a modest thing at first, a Michigan charity with a small endowment meant to fund education and public welfare in the state. Most people who heard about it assumed it was a tax write off, a rich man putting a little money toward good causes. That assumption was exactly what the family was happy to let people believe. B-roll, 1930s Detroit factory exterior, black and white, smokestacks, but the timing was not an accident. In the 1930s, the federal estate tax in the United States had climbed steeply. By the late 1930s, the top rate on the largest estates had reached deep into the 70s as a percentage. And during the war years, it would climb higher still, eventually touching the high 70s on the biggest fortunes. For an ordinary wealthy family, that was a painful tax bill. For the Fords, it was something worse. It was a threat to control of the company itself. Think about the problem in plain terms. The Ford Motor Company was privately held. The Ford family owned essentially all of it. There was no public market, no easy way to sell a few shares to raise cash. So when Henry Ford died, the government would value his stake at an enormous number, and then it would demand a tax bill equal to a huge fraction of that value, payable in actual dollars. Roll. Close up of an old accounting ledger, fountain pen, columns of figures. Where would that cash come from? The family did not have it sitting in an account. To pay the estate tax, the heirs might be forced to sell a large block of the company. And selling a large block of a private company usually means letting outsiders in, taking the company public, or handing a competitor a foothold. The estate tax, in other words, was not just a cost. It was the one force that could have pried the company out of the family's hands. That is the antagonist of this whole story. Not a rival automaker, not a bank, the estate tax. A law that, left alone, would have broken 3 generations of family control in a single afternoon at the probate court. Roll. Gavel resting on a stack of papers, courtroom bench in soft focus. Edsel Ford died first in 1943 while the war was still on. His death was an early test of the structure, and it sharpened the family's thinking about what would happen when Henry, the founder himself, was gone. By the mid 1940s, the plan was fully in place. The Ford Foundation, that quiet little Michigan charity from 1936, had become the designated vessel. It was ready to receive the part of the fortune that the family wanted to protect from the taxman, while the family kept the part that actually mattered to them. And the genius of it was that those were not the same part. Roll vintage Ford automobile, restored slow rotating shot in a museum. Here is the mechanism. I want to name it plainly because the names matter. The first piece is a private foundation. A private foundation is a charity funded by a single source, usually one family or one company, rather than by the broad public. Under United States tax law, it is a tax exempt entity. When you give assets to it, those assets generally leave your taxable estate. They are no longer yours in the eyes of the estate tax because legally they belong to the charity now. Roll marble building facade with carved lettering, institutional and old. The second piece is the part most people miss. It is called dual class stock. A company can issue more than one class of shares. The classes can be almost identical in how they share the profits, the dividends, the economic value of the business. But they can be very different in one thing: the right to vote. One class might carry the votes that elect the board and control the company. The other class might carry little or no voting power at all, just the right to receive money. So picture two stacks of paper. Both stacks represent ownership of the same company. One stack is the voting stock. Whoever holds it runs the company, hires the director, sets the direction. The other stack is the non voting stock. Whoever holds it gets the dividends, the economic upside, the value, but never gets a vote on anything. Two separate stacks of stock certificates side by side on a table. Now watch what the family did with those two stacks. They put the non voting stock, the part that holds the economic value but carries no control, into the foundation. The foundation received the money side of the company, and the foundation, being a charity, kept that value out of the estate tax. They kept the voting stock, the small stack that controls everything, in family hands. The votes never went to the charity. The votes stayed exactly where they always were. Contrast the two outcomes. If the family had simply held one ordinary block of stock and passed it down at death, the government would have valued the whole thing and taxed it. And to pay the tax, the family might have lost control. Instead, by splitting the company into economics and control, and giving away only the economics, the family handed over the bulk of the dollar value while keeping every last vote. Roll chessboard, hand moving a single piece while the rest stays still. Let me walk the mechanism step by step, the way it actually worked. Step 1: years before the founder's death, create the foundation. Get it established, recognized, and quietly running. The Fords did this in 1936, more than a decade before they needed it. Step 2: recapitalize the company so that there are two classes of shares, voting and non voting. The voting class is small. The non voting class holds most of the economic value. Step 3: arrange the estate plan so that on death, the non voting shares flow to the foundation. The foundation is tax exempt, so this transfer largely escapes the estate tax that would otherwise apply. Step 4: The voting shares pass to the family through the ordinary plan. Because the voting shares are a small slice of the total dollar value, the tax exposure on them is far smaller than it would have been on the whole company. Step 5. The family now sits on the board of the company and also influences the foundation. They run the business through their votes. The foundation owns the money, but does not run the company. Control and economics are split, and the family is on the right side of both. B roll. Organizational chart drawn by hand on paper, boxes, and connecting. Now, the legal reality, because I want to be careful here. None of these tools are secret, and none of them are illegal. They are written into law. Private foundations operate under Section 501 SE3 of the Internal Revenue Code, the same section that covers charities generally. The rules that specifically govern private foundations, the ones about minimum yearly payouts to charity, about self-dealing, about how much of a business a foundation may own. Oh, those rules were tightened later in the Tax Reform Act of 1969. That is an important date, and I will come back to it. But in the 1930s and 1940s, when the Fords built their structure, those tighter limits did not yet exist. A foundation could hold a very large stake in a single company, and the Ford Foundation did exactly that. Bound volumes of tax code on a library shelf, spines facing out dual class shares are equally real and equally legal. Companies use them to this day. The whole point is to let a founder or a family raise money or transfer value while keeping voting control concentrated in a few hands. It is a standard tool, and it sits in plain sight in corporate charters. So when I say the Fords kept control while giving away the company, I am not describing a trick that broke any rule. I am describing a structure that followed the rules precisely and used the gap between economic ownership and voting control that the law itself allows. Here is the catch, though, and every family that copies this learns it eventually. The wealth you put into a foundation is no longer yours to spend on yourself. A foundation is a charity. Its money must, by law, go toward charitable purposes. The family does not get to take the foundation's billions and buy houses with them. They get influence over how that money is given away, and they get the prestige and the network that comes with directing a great institution. But the cash itself has left the family's pocket for good. That is the trade. You keep control of the company and the name. You give up personal ownership of the dollars. For a family that cares more about dynasty than about spending, it is a trade they will make every time. The open question, the one I will answer next, is just how much money actually moved when Henry Ford finally died. Roll. Portrait photograph of an older man in 1940s clothing, sepia tone. Henry Ford died on April 7th, 1947, at his estate in Dearborn, Michigan. He was 83 years old. The river near his home had flooded, the power was out, and he died by candlelight in a house lit the way it had been in his childhood. The man who put the world on wheels left it in the dark. Roll. Candle burning in a dim room, rain visible through a window. When the estate was settled, the structure built over the previous decade did exactly what it was designed to do. The Ford Foundation received the overwhelming majority of the company's stock. The figure usually cited is that the foundation ended up holding roughly 90% of the equity in Ford Motor Company. But, and this is the whole point, Those were the non voting shares. They were the economics of the company, the dividends and the value, but not the controls. The Ford family retained the voting shares. The figure usually cited there is that the family kept the Class B stock that carried essentially all of the voting power, around 40% of the votes by the time the company eventually went public, structured so that the family could continue to control the company even while owning a minority of its economic value. Roll. Vintage stock certificate close up, embossed seal and signatures. Read those two facts together and you see the magic. 90% of the company's value went to the foundation. 100% of the founder's intended control stayed with the family. The estate tax, which could have demanded a payment so large that the family would have had to sell the company to pay it, was largely avoided because the assets that carried the value had already left Henry Ford's taxable estate and entered a tax exempt charity. Put a number on what was at stake. By the late 1940s, the Ford Motor Company was one of the largest industrial enterprises on Earth. Estimates of the foundation's holdings, when the company later went public in 1956, valued the foundation's stake in the range of $500 million and up in 1950s money. That sale alone made the Ford Foundation, for a time, the largest philanthropic organization in the world. Translate $500 million 1950s dollars into today's purchasing power, and you are talking about many billions. Roll. Stock exchange floor, 1950s, men in suits and hats, black and white. Now compare that to what the estate tax would have taken. At the rates that era, a straightforward transfer of a company that size could have triggered a tax bill in the hundreds of millions of dollars due in cash. The family did not have hundreds of millions in cash. To raise it, they would have had to sell a controlling block to outsiders. The structure is what stopped that from happening. The foundation absorbed the value, the family kept the votes, and the tax that could have ended Ford family control simply never landed with full force. Large industrial complex aerial view, sprawling factory, mid-century. There is a sequel to this that proves the point. In 1969, Congress passed the Tax Reform Act, and one of the things it did was attack exactly this kind of arrangement. The new law put strict limits on how much of a single business a private foundation could own, a rule called the Excess Business Holdings Rule. Foundations were forced over time to sell down their large stakes in family companies. The Ford Foundation gradually sold its Ford Motor stock and diversified into a broad portfolio. Roll. Newspaper front page from 1969, headline about tax reform, folded. So the structure that protected the family in 1947 was no longer fully available to anyone starting fresh after 1969. The door the Fords walked through was narrowed behind them. That is often how it goes with these tools. The first families to use them get the full benefit. By the time the law catches up, the dynasty is already established, and the rules that close the gap arrive a generation too late. B-roll, heavy wooden door slowly closing, light narrowing to a sliver. Now let me turn the camera around and talk about regular people, because the contrast is the whole lesson. Most people I have ever spoken with about money keep everything in one place. One country, one currency, one bank, often one type of account. Their home, their savings, their retirement, Their business, if they have one, all sit inside a single jurisdiction and a single legal system. It feels safe because it feels simple. You can see it all in one statement. Roll, single bank statement on a kitchen table, coffee cup beside it. But concentration is fragility. When everything sits in one place, everything is exposed to the same single set of risks at the same time. One change in the tax law of one country touches all of it. One lawsuit, one creditor, one frozen account, one bank failure, one currency devaluation, and the whole structure shakes at once. There is no second leg to stand on. Roll, house of cards on a table, a hand near it, tension in the frame. The wealthy families I studied did the opposite by instinct. They never let everything ride on one outcome. The Fords separated economics from control so that attacks in one form could not take both. Other old families spread assets across more than one country, more than one currency, more than one type of legal structure, so that no single government, no single court, no single crisis could reach all of it in one move. Roll world map on age paper, small markers placed in several regions. This is not about hiding money, and I want to be clear about that. Hiding income from tax authorities is illegal, and that is not what these families did. What they did was structure ownership and spread it across legal forms and places openly and within the law so that the wealth had more than one place to live. Diversification of where and how you hold assets is simply the opposite of putting all your eggs in one basket. Roll a single egg in one basket, then a slow pullback revealing several baskets. The reason ordinary fortunes vanish in a few generations usually comes down to this single failure. Everything is concentrated. So, when the one bad event arrives, and over decades it always arrives, there is no protected core that survives it. The estate tax, a lawsuit, a bad divorce, a market crash, a family feud, any one of these can drain a concentrated fortune completely. A structured one bends, but does not break, because the parts are held separately, and no single blow can reach them all. Roll oak tree in a storm, branches bending, but trunk holding firm. So, how do you actually use any of this in your own life? Carefully and with real professionals. I am not your attorney, and I am not your accountant. And what follows is general history and general education, not a plan for your situation. Handshake between two people across a desk, folders visible. Foundations and structures like them are not only for billionaires anymore, but the serious version still requires serious scale and real legal work. For most families, the smaller cousins of these tools, properly drafted trusts, are what an estate attorney will actually discuss with you. The principle the Fords used, separating control from economic ownership, shows up in ordinary planning too, in the way a well built trust can let one person manage assets while others benefit from them. B roll. A leather bound estate planning binder being opened on a desk dual class shares are a real option for people who own private businesses. If you build a company and you want to bring in investors or pass economic value to your children without handing over the steering wheel, a dual class structure is a recognized way to do it. A corporate attorney can tell you whether it fits and what it costs to set up and maintain. International diversification in its honest and legal form simply means not holding every asset in one country. For most people, that can start with something as ordinary as owning globally diversified investments rather than betting everything on a single nation's market. The more advanced versions, holding accounts or property across borders, come with real reporting obligations to your home tax authority, and you must follow them. Done in the open with full disclosure, it is lawful. Done in secret, it is not. Beryl. Globe on a desk, hand resting lightly on it. Soft light. If you want to explore any of this seriously, the professional to start with is a qualified estate planning attorney, ideally one who is board certified in estate planning or tax law in your jurisdiction, working alongside a tax advisor. An initial consultation is often a few $100s, and a complete estate plan with trust commonly runs from a couple of thousand into the low tens of thousands of dollars, depending on complexity. For a family business structure with dual class shares, the legal work is more involved and costs more. Those numbers are general ranges, not quotes. And the only way to know your real cost is to ask a professional directly. Business card and a pen resting on a wooden table, professional setting. I want to leave you back where we started, in the quiet rooms where these decisions are really made. The Fords did not get rich because of a foundation. They got rich because Henry Ford built something the world wanted. But they stayed rich across generations because of the structure. The car made the money, the paperwork kept it, and almost no one outside the family ever understood the difference. Restored Ford car parked outside a grand old house at dusk. That is the part I most want you to take with you. Building wealth and keeping wealth are two completely different skills. The world is full of advice on how to make money. The families who last for 100 years spend at least as much energy on how to hold it, how to separate control from value, how to spread it so no single event could take it all. Roll, family portrait on a mantelpiece, multiple generations, vintage frames. You do not need $1 billion to learn from that. You need to ask the simple question they all asked. If the worst happened, the tax, the lawsuit, the crash, would my family be protected? Or is everything sitting in one place waiting for one bad day? That single question, asked to the right professional, is worth more than any trick. If this kind of history is useful to you, the way these old structures actually worked under the law, then stay with me. In the next one, I want to go back even further to 1907, to the panic that nearly broke the American banking system, and the holding company trick that one man used to sit at the center of it all. His name was J.P. Morgan. And what he built to control a crisis tells you almost everything about how power and money are quietly held to this day. I will see you there.